Good morning. Welcome to Courageous Women. This morning we will be telling the story of Chipeta, who was a Ute woman who lived in the Colorado mountains until her people were pushed into the Uinta Basin. Her story is a compelling story, and it tells us a lot about what life is like when unforeseen things change what you know. Chipeta was a legend in her own people. They did not write down stories. They told the stories from mouth to mouth, and so there are different views of where she was born and who exactly she was to begin with. We do know that she was adopted by the Ute tribe. They think that most authors think that she was from an Apache tribe, that she was found wandering after a massacre of her people by the Ute, and they took her home and raised her as their own. So during the period of time that she lived on the earth, there was a hunter-gatherer way of life for the Ute tribe. There were actually 7 Ute tribes. Her people were called the Tabawatch tribe from Colorado, and most of that area was their home. They would come down off of the mountains into the Denver area and do their hunting for buffalo on the plains. So that was also part of their territory. However, they were interacting with other tribes from the plains, which was not always peaceful. There was a lot of tribal unrest and killing, families being disrupted by all of this tribal reach for territory. And so they didn't always get along, but they did rely upon the buffalo for much of their food. And they had reign of all of the Colorado Rockies that we know into Utah. Their tribe mainly just right there in the Colorados down to the eastern side or western side of the mountains. They knew a life where in the winter they settled in the valleys and tried to stay in the warm areas. In the wintertime, they traveled the mountains. They had different hunting areas where they were used to hunting their food. They knew where to gather. They had the pinyon pines were very much a staple for their lifestyle. And so they were used to Mother Earth giving them what they needed. Suddenly their life changed when people found gold in the mountains of Colorado. It was just after the United States had fought the war with Mexico, and they had gained that territory as theirs. And people were beginning to move west, trying to make their fortunes in the gold fields of Colorado. At first, the Utes were fairly tolerant of the people coming and searching for gold. They could trade with them and use what they had for their gain. But as they began to congregate, suddenly there were 50,000 men in their territory, and suddenly their whole life was changing. They were being moved around, and their hunting grounds were being taken. Things were not peaceful between the Ute and the white encroachers on their land at this time. So today I'm going to flip the screen and let you see our display while we're talking. Whoops, I flipped it back. Let's see if I can do that again. There we go. This is our display of Chipeta. The reason we have the display is because we actually have artifacts that were made by her hand, which is very wonderful when you think about the opportunity of a museum having something that belonged or having provenance on beadwork that we have in the museum. We do not know most of the people who have given us the beadwork, and so to have the provenance on Chipeta is why we decided to do this display. And as I studied her life, I was amazed at her story. So Chipeta was raised with the Tabawatch tribe, and one of the members of the tribe, but he did not live with the tribe for the first part of his life, was, in our area, we say Ore. In Colorado, where I used to live, they say Ure, and in the books, they say Ure. He was a young boy whose father was Ute and his mother was Apache, and so he was raised down in the Taos area of New Mexico. He was trained by Jesuit priests in his schooling. He had some interaction with white people. He understood English, Spanish, Apache, and Ute. When he got a little older, his mother passed away and his father went back to the hills to live with his Ute tribe. And that's when he met his first wife, who some say was Chipeta's sister, and married her, and she had a child, and then she passed away, and Chipeta was assigned by the family to be the person who took over the care of this young child. She was very good at what she had been trained as a young girl to do. She knew how to be a woman in the Ute tribe, which was a very important job and very strenuous in many ways. The women were the ones who tanned all the hides. They were the ones who made the tents. They were the ones who prepared the food for storing and for eating on an everyday basis. It was the woman's job to make all the clothing that they wore, which was made from the hides of the animals that they tanned the hides from. It was a labor-intensive life, and she did it very well. She not only knew how to do all of the jobs that a Ute woman would be considered important to do for her family, but she also became very skilled at beading and decorating the clothes that she made for her family. As more and more people encroached upon the lands, the traditional land of the Tabawatch tribe, Ouray realized that from his interactions and education he'd received in earlier life, that there was a need for the people, the Ute, to have lay claim upon their land. And he decided the way for them to lay claim upon their land would be to make treaty with the U.S. government. And thus began his long journey in trying to carve out a piece of property that the Ute tribe could own and be considered the owners of, in a time when people were grasping out their land, trying to homestead and mine and do the things that they also were trying to carve out new lives for themselves. He put together a group of men that went out to Washington, D.C. to make a treaty with the U.S. government. And at the time, the only tribe that was represented in all the 7 tribes of the Ute was the Tabawatch tribe. And they were all young men. The older men didn't go with them. And so that caused some interesting interactions between the different tribes of the Ute. Chipeta was born in about 1843. In 1848, the U.S. settled the war with Mexico. And then in 1859, she married Ouray. And that was the same year the gold was discovered in Colorado. So in about 61, Colorado Territory was organized, and Ouray took his first trip to Washington in 1863. So it was in 1863 that he first made efforts to make a treaty, and the purpose, because of his understanding, his education, his purpose was to give them something so that they wouldn't totally lose everything. Chipeta was with him a lot on the plains and when they would go places. And during one of their buffalo hunting trips, their son, the one that she was raising, was kidnapped and taken. And they never did get him back. But in that process, she went through a huge grieving time and was very discouraged. And this was also the same time when Ouray was trying to make things work. And so he started confiding in Chipeta, and she became his partner in trying to help the Utes understand the side of the U.S. settlers that were coming out, and also to be a voice of for the Ute tribes that were struggling with the obvious change of life that they were encountering as the settlers were encroaching on their land. She actually traveled with Ouray a lot as he went around to the different tribes and the different leaders of and elders of the Utes, and as he tried to get them to understand what he was trying to do. The first president that he met was Lincoln, and he didn't actually negotiate with Lincoln, but he did receive a gift from him. He got a cane that he wore or used in a picture that became famous of him. I'll see if you can see this. This is a picture of him when he was on his first trip to Washington, D.C. The cane that's there on his leg was the one that President Lincoln gave to him. And he's wearing a medal around his neck that was given to him for peace, his efforts of peace. When he got back from Washington, I'm going to look for a picture that I can show you. They made the Treaty of 1860. I think it was 60. Maybe if I go over here, we can see. Well, the original treaty, the original Ute territory, let's see if I can open the case so you can see a little better, was this area. It was Utah, most of Utah and Colorado. And the very first treaty they made, I was right, it was 1868. Let's see if I can. They took away everything that was east of the Continental Divide. So that became the new area, the first treaty that he made with the United States. So when he would go to these tribal, or to the Washington, D.C., he would go in regalia that Chipeta made for him. She would, every time he went, and he actually went 6 times in his what they called him was a chief. That is not a word that the Native Americans use, and they quite resent it. It's actually elder is what they would be called, and he wasn't considered an elder so much in their tribe. He was appointed a chief by the white government. So that also caused some problems for them in trying to negotiate with his Ute brothers and sisters, because he wasn't given the authority through the tribal traditions, which made it also difficult. He again had to go and negotiate for their lands. They just weren't happy with the fact that they couldn't have the San Juan Mountains. And in that period of time, they tried to get the San Juan Mountains by buying them and promising Ouray and Chipeta that if they did give them that land, or let them buy that land, that they would find their son. In the first instance, when they asked him if that would be something they would work with, Ouray said no. He was adamant about not having that happen. But in that very same year, they again took him back out to Washington. So he went to Washington 2 times in 1 year in order for them to try to get the San Juan Mountains. So you can see in this illustration that the San Juan Mountains were pulled out of that square. Do you see where the San Juan Mountains were taken from them? Eventually, they did on the second trip that same year. That was when all the tribes were represented, when the delegation went out there. And during that period of time, they were able to see a boy that the government decided was their son, but the boy refused and said that they were not his parents. He was a Arapaho, and he didn't like the Utes. They had been bad for his people. So he did not come to them. So they lost those properties during those years, and it was very difficult. I'm sorry there, I'm trying to get this back where it belongs. It's a very interesting story of interactions between white and Ute and Ute and Ute and government and Ute. There really was no answer that would be perfect because they would be losing every time. And so, in a way, it's a very sad story, but throughout it all, Chipeta tried very hard to foster peace between these different entities of people. She was known for her kindness and for her gentle spirit. There was one time when her own brother tried to kill Ore, and if it hadn't been for her stopping them, that would have happened. On the last trip one of the things that happened was that the Meeker massacre in, let me see if I can get the right date, it was 1868. The White River Utes were very tired of what was happening to them. They loved the horse. The horse was very important to them, and their Indian agent, his last name was Meeker, was determined that they were going to become farmers. And they were, one of the ways he tried to instill that into the people was he took their racetrack and dug it all up so they could not use that racetrack anymore. And they were so upset with him, especially when they found out that he was getting extra troops to come in and try to help them with their goals. They massacred him. They killed he and a couple of his other men that were there, and then they took their families and hostage. This made the world of the United States very upset, and there was lots of talk and anger throughout the United States about the Utes and what they were doing, and there was a call for them to be eliminated or all pushed out of Colorado into other places. And so there was another delegation of Utes that went to Washington again, and this time Chipeta went with and testified in the courts of Washington, D.C., in the halls of Washington, D.C., suing for peace between her people and the white people. This is a picture that was taken while they were there. There was a double exposure or something, and that would be another set of clothes that she made specifically for she and Ore to go and talk in the halls of Washington. This was just before Ore was so tired of everything that had happened to his people. His negotiations, his hopes, his dreams had all been dashed. They made promises to them that they didn't keep, and he was pretty upset with the U.S. government for the way they'd been treated. He had been to Washington, D.C. 6 times. And by this time, he had a disease called Bright's disease that had started to overtake his body. And when he went back to Colorado, he decided he needed to talk with his tribal leaders one more time, trying to sue for peace. And in the extent of trying to do this, he passed away of Bright's disease. So Chipeta lost her husband at a very volatile time in Colorado. And they had such a good relationship of trust between them, and always using each other for strength and positive reinforcement on trying to sue for peace for their people. It wasn't long before, because he died, that treaty was never made. And it wasn't long before the government of Colorado decided that they were going to get rid of all of the Utes. They were going to all be pushed into the Uinta Basin, where the Uinta Utes were already residing. I want to read just one little thing that was written by one of the soldiers that was there that day pushing the people into Utah. It was a summer morning in 1881. Chipeta found herself herded at gunpoint from her home in Colorado to a faraway reservation. Surrounded by 9 companies of cavalry and an equal complement of infantry, the Utes were told to be ready in 2 hours. The order was emphasized with 6 pieces of field artillery, so 1,458 men, women, and children set out on a 350-mile march to Utah. More than 1,000 Army troops watched the Utes leave peacefully. One soldier reported, "We saw the whole Ute nation streaming by on horseback and on foot. As they passed our camps, their gait broke into a run. Sheep were abandoned, blankets and personal possessions strewn along the road. Women and children were loudly wailing. As we pushed the Indians onward, we permitted the whites to follow, and in 3 days the rich lands of the Uncompaghre were all occupied. Towns were being laid out and lots being sold at high prices." So they pushed the Utes out of Colorado and they took over their land. I think her story here in the Uinta Basin is a story of a woman who continued to follow through with her traditional jobs and culture that she had been taught as she was young. I want you to see just, this is where they lived in the Uncompaghre area. In fact, the tribe is now known as the Uncompaghre because they were pushed over into that area. But do you see how beautiful that is? And this is where her family was settled, in the Uinta Basin. What a stark difference that would have been. She was upset with the U.S. government for many of the things that happened, and rightfully so. In the Uncompaghre area, they had a lot of advantages because of her husband's help. They were given a cabin and a farm. Now she refused to live in a house or a cabin. She lived in a traditional teepee for the rest of her life. This is her family. I just want to take you over to the case again and let you see some of her handiwork. Oops. So these are some little tiny doll type moccasins that she made. This is a really pretty coin purse. As you see, the traditional clothing that she used here on the picture, she would have beaded. Beautiful panels of beading to put on it. She also was skilled at basket making. This is one of, I'm going to open this side. This is one of my favorite things that she made. She died in 1923, having lived a long life. She can be an example of strength to us today. She went through very hard things, and yet she survived intact, being kind, helping others. She did not give up. She had strength that I can't imagine pulling out of myself. I hope you enjoyed talking about Chipeta a little bit today. There are so many more stories. Oops, I should do that again. Let's go back to the back. There's this book for children. It's really nice if you want to just learn a little bit more about her. I enjoyed this book. It's called Chipeta, Queen of the Utes. That was actually a derogatory term that they used for her when she went back to Washington. She wasn't a queen. She was just a very peace-loving woman. There's this book on Ouray if you're interested in finding out about her husband. And all of these books are available in our bookstore. We also have Wise Women, which talks about other wise women, but she's also included in this book. And there's one more book called Unbroken Spirits, and that's her in the center. This is what she looked like in the last years of her life. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a great day.